All right, guys, we are going to be doing some notes. I am currently on the way to Ravenna, so we are going to have you guys take notes here. This is Simonson, just to remind you, whenever you need to go back, fast forward, do whatever you need to do with this video. But for right now, we are going to take notes on life during the Civil War. This is Unit 5, Part 2. This is going to be the second part of our notes on when we discuss the Civil War here. So it's actually really interesting stuff. I hope you guys will pay a lot of attention to this. Of course, aside from some of this being on the test, it just really is fascinating to know what life was like in the United States as the war rages on. So first, the big thing that the North is really trying to do is the North wants to make sure the South is all alone. Now, the Confederacy, the South had really hoped that other nations, in particular Great Britain, would help out the South, because remember, the South is dominated by cotton. And so the idea is that since other nations in the world rely on cotton and rely on cheap cotton, they might help support the Confederacy. In reality, what actually happens is Britain does not get involved in the war at all, which is what the North really wanted. And there's a few reasons for this. So like I said, the South thought cotton would be their main draw for support. But the problem was, in India, which the British controlled, there had suddenly been a steep increase in the amount of cotton being produced, so cotton prices still remained relatively low. Also, you have to remember that Great Britain at this point in time had already abolished slavery, and so there was a lot of support for the North within Great Britain, because people were like, why would we support somebody who wants to keep slavery when we ourselves don't have slavery? And Britain was actually more concerned with maintaining their trade ties with the North. So overall, the other countries of the world stayed out, which was a huge advantage to the North and really kind of devastated the South, who had been hoping that this intervention by other nations might help them get their independence, if you will. Okay, one of the most pivotal moments of the Civil War was the Emancipation Proclamation. You've learned about it since you were kids. It's that it's the declaration given by Abraham Lincoln in January of 1863. A lot of times we think that the Emancipation Proclamation freed all the slaves. That's not entirely true. The Emancipation Proclamation had a very limited scope. It only actually freed the slaves that were in the South. So like any territory that the Northern soldiers had taken from Southerners, those slaves were free. But it did not free the slaves in the Union border states. Basically, any slave states that had not joined in rebellion could still keep their slaves. And so in practice, it sounds like, well, this really didn't do a whole lot. It basically just, it freed slaves in the South, whoop-de-doo. Didn't do anything with the slave states in the Union, but here is kind of the big deal, why this is so important. Before the Emancipation Proclamation, there were a lot of issues being discussed, like, okay, this is about saving the Union. This is about making sure that the federal government is over the states when it comes to laws that are made at the national level versus the state level. When Abraham Lincoln issues the Emancipation Proclamation, the war is not just about bringing the Union back together. Now the war is about slavery. And when he issues the Emancipation Proclamation, this declaration that the southern states must free their slaves, there's no way this war can end peacefully anymore. Either one side wins and the other side loses. There's no way that they can both just peacefully coexist. And so this guaranteed that the war would be all about slavery, and that there was no way that this war could end peacefully. Just as a side note, and I have it in the caption there, Abraham Lincoln himself personally opposed slavery. We've talked about that. But he did not believe he had the power to end it where it already existed. He thought the Constitution did not give him the authority to ban slavery. Now, the really opposition that arises to the war effort in the North, and they will be called Copperheads. Copperheads were Democrats who sought peace with the South. Now, when we call them Copperheads, because that's what people at the time called them, and it wasn't like a nice statement. I have a picture up here of an actual Copperhead. So the title was an insult, like by calling these these northern Democrats who wanted to see peace with the South. By calling them copperheads, they're basically calling them snakes, traitors. But it was a group of people who saw that the war wasn't going very well, that a lot of people were dying in the conflict, and so they wanted to just negotiate peace with the South, maybe bring them back into the Union with slavery allowed, or allow their independence. You're also going to see some attacks on Union recruiting stations, and as a result, Abraham Lincoln suspended the right to habeas corpus, or a right to trial. The only time in our nation's history this has ever happened. We all, as citizens, have the right to a fair and speedy trial. Abraham Lincoln temporarily suspended that right, and the only time in American history that has ever happened. Now, eventually the Supreme Court would rule that he couldn't do that, but still. With the increasing death toll, the amount of soldiers on both sides will start to run low, and so both sides will institute a draft, or sometimes it's called conscription. So conscription is a military draft. And it was open to about everyone, but here's the thing. More often than not, the poor would be the ones who actually got drafted and actually had to fight for a few reasons. One, the wealthy could pay for somebody to take their place, or they could just pay a fee for avoiding the draft altogether. And so a lot of times it was, like I said, the poor people who wound up getting drafted. Now, I will say this, most of the Union Army was made up of volunteers. It wasn't just conscripted men, people who were forced to be in the Army who were there, but it was still a big deal. And you did see a lot of riots. I have pictures here of people who would burn draft agencies, and sometimes Republican newspapers, because Republicans represented the North at this time. A lot of times Republican newspapers would be burned in retaliation to the draft. So it was controversial. And it was controversial in the South too. Don't get me wrong, it's not just a northern issue. Now, what role did African Americans play in the Civil War? 180,000 African Americans fought with the Union. The first time we ever see African Americans fully enlisted into the Union. But most were segregated, and a lot were banned from fighting until Abraham Lincoln gave the Emancipation Proclamation. Even still, after they were allowed to fight because of the Emancipation Proclamation, oftentimes they were just reduced to cleaning duties. They didn't often see battle, and also they were very rarely taken as prisoners of war. Now, one of the most famous African American regiments is the Massachusetts 54th, which was the first fully African American regiment. And on the next slide here, there was a movie that was actually made back in 1989 that kind of highlighted the difficulties and struggles of the 54th Massachusetts, and it was called Glory. It's got Matthew Broderick, Ferris Bueller's Day Off, Denzel Washington, Morgan Freeman. In fact, I think for Denzel Washington, if I remember correctly, this kind of launched him to one of his first Academy Awards. For Best Supporting Actor. So if you're ever interested in some extra out-of-school watching, Glory is a very good film. It is, unfortunately, a little graphic in its violence, but it is a very good movie that kind of highlights the difficulties of the Massachusetts 54th. Okay, now on the economic side, and this is going to be really important, particularly for the South, but the North to a good extent too. The South is really going to be devastated by the Civil War economically. One, you see slave resistance hurting farming. As the South loses more and more ground, slaves become more and more, how should I say this? They become less willing to fight, they become less willing to work and cooperate. And so sometimes they would just be purposefully obstinate or purposefully not do much, because they figured that they were going to be freed soon anyway, so they kind of hurt the southern farmers. The North still maintained their blockade, and so limited supplies were getting in to the South. Also, the South, who had much less troops to begin with, was slowly losing manpower as well. On the North, on the other hand, the North, for the most part, is benefiting from the war. The North experiences massive economic growth because it's maintaining its trade. Now, part of what fuels that economic growth is that the white men are leaving and are going off to war, and the people who are taking their place are women, immigrants, and African Americans, and the bosses are paying them less to take on the roles that the white men had taken. But it does lead to a massive growth in wealth because the price of goods does fall. We also see that the North will institute the first ever income tax to pay for the war. I know it's that dirty tax word, but for the first time we will see an income tax. But if we want to be very honest, the ultimate killer of the Civil War is not the actual fighting, it is disease. New technology left more open wounds, and that led to infection. So it's not the deadliness of the weapons themselves, but the fact that the wounds remain open, that is what causes a lot of the problems. And a lot of times, amputation was the only way to treat the wounds. Gangrene in particular was a nasty disease that affected both Northerners and Southerners, and I have some images ahead. I'll give you a warning. They're not of gangrene in the Civil War times, but they are modern cases of gangrene, and they are graphic, so just prepare yourself if you are weak of stomach. But for now, the total battle-related deaths, so total deaths in the war, 110,000 for the North, 94,000 for the South, so the North definitely lost more people. But take a look at those disease deaths. Doubling, both times more than doubling, or I guess not the South isn't doubling, but still, almost doubling the amount of deaths in battle was the deaths from disease. And so disease is the ultimate killer. It's not the battle, it's the diseases that come afterward. So now we're going to get to those images ahead. These are images of gangrene, and by the way, it's dead skin. I mean, it's dead, and it's, like I said, it's not pretty. So if you are weak of stomach, feel free to turn away. But these next few images will be of what gangrene looks like. Here's one on somebody's hand. And that's, like I said, that's dead skin. This is on somebody's toes. This is on somebody's foot here. This is the last image. I also want to emphasize, how does one get gangrene? You basically get gangrene, like, let's say you're in the battlefield and you get clipped or somehow like by the shrapnel, and basically somehow the wounds get open, so you have some exposed skin, and that skin will somehow get infected by the gangrene bacteria. That will then spread throughout the body. And that's why the amputations were necessary, by the way. This is a progressive disease, meaning it continues to spread throughout the body. So once you have gangrene, it's only going to continue to spread. So that's why amputations were necessary, to prevent the further spread of gangrene, because it can ultimately kill you. All right, lastly, go ahead and do this together with Mrs. Simonson. What was the Emancipation Proclamation? Please explain it. And tell me why conscription was so controversial. Why wasn't it equal? All right, your funnies for this Monday. When the teacher says define happiness, this is my answer. This is what it looks like when Buzz Lightyear shows up on Marshall University's campus. If you don't get this, you were born too late. And finally, and I say this because it makes fun of me, book lovers never go to bed alone. All right, that is it. If there is extra time, Mrs. Simonson has a very entertaining link that I have sent her on the different Civil War beards. But other than that, I will see you guys tomorrow. Have a good Monday.